Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. As the world's oldest humanitarian, human rights, and advocacy organization, we've been at the forefront of fighting for Israel's right to exist peacefully since before the state was established. Since 1947, we've served as an NGO accredited to the United Nations, where we continue to work tirelessly to ensure that key issues are addressed with a specific focus on the safety of Israel and the Jewish people. And we see the ongoing efforts to portray Israel as a racist state practicing a system of apartheid, similar to the one practiced by the infamous South African regime, as outrageous and dangerous. This terrible accusation against the Jewish state, which aims to criminalize its very existence, is not only coming from the United Nations, an organization that has already accustomed us to its type of outrageous language due to its undeniable bias against Israel, but also from global human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And we cannot remain silent in the face of these very serious and libelous attacks. And that's why we decided to convene a group of renowned international law experts who use their authoritative voices to respond to these dangerous and false accusations. We've already completed the first part of a report, which is now available on our website. And we have the honor today to speak with our first two contributors, Eugene Kantorovich and Thane Rosenbaum. Professor Kantorovich is a professor at George Mason's Antonin Scalia School of Law and the director of its Center for International Law in the Middle East. An expert in international and constitutional law, he has published more than 30 academic articles in leading law reviews and peer-reviewed journals. His scholarship has been cited in precedent-setting international law cases in the U.S. and abroad. Professor Rosenbaum is a law professor, legal and Middle East analyst, novelist, essayist, and distinguished university professor at Touro University, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. He's the author of numerous books and articles and has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, CNN, and the Daily Beast, among other publications. He's also a legal analyst for CBS News Radio. Eugene, Thane, thank you so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here, Dan.
I'd also like to welcome Adriana Comisar, our special advisor on Latin American and UN affairs, who will conduct the interview with me. Adriana, thank you for joining us today as well.
Pleasure.
So the first question goes to Eugene. You mentioned in the report titled Israel Apartheid is the New Zionism Equals Racism, that the baseless comparisons between Israel and the apartheid South African regime are not new, and note the infamous 1975 United Nations General Assembly resolution that stated Zionism was a form of racism. This resolution, by the way, was approved by the United Nations only 30 years after the Holocaust. The truth is that we're used to expecting this type of outrageous allegation from the United Nations. But we now see major global human rights organizations making the same claims. Why do you think this is happening?
I think it's happening for a number of reasons. And some of those reasons, I think, are good reasons, or that is to say, encouraging reasons. You can see this from the rhetoric and, let's say, the publicity campaigns surrounding the release of the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International reports. It's clear they were aiming for headlines because they would say, for the first time ever, Human Rights Watch says Israel is an apartheid state. They've said it in various ways before. Something really new. Now we're saying Israel is an apartheid state. And as I show in my paper, as we just discussed, there's nothing new about this, right? As a matter of fact, like many other forms of anti-Semitism, it's hard to come up with something new. We've seen it all before. And in particular, this was the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution specifically talks about Israel's imperialist, racist South Africa. And of course, there were hardly any settlements at the time. It wasn't about the West Bank. It was about the idea that the idea of a Jewish state is illegitimate, and they compare it to South Africa. So we know it's not new. So they're trying to get some attention to accusations against Israel. And I think, so the good news, I'll tell you the good news. The good news is it shows that a lot of other rhetoric that has been used to attempt to demonize and single out Israel and make Israel beyond the pale hasn't worked, right? So for a long time, they were talking for a long time about Israeli human rights abuses, and nobody believes that story anymore. They were talking a lot about the occupation, and people say this is Jews living in communities. Palestinians numerous times had an opportunity to choose to end the occupation, to choose a state, and the Palestinian refusal to do so has made people tired, I think, also of the occupation narrative. So they need to turn up the rhetoric, and it's very hard for them to do because they're already maxed out. And I hope I won't be frivolous to say it's like Spinal Tap. In the movie Spinal Tap, when you have the heavy metal band and then the guitar's turned up to 10, right? Where, like, if you're already rocking out at 10, where else can you go? You need to add 11. There's no 11. It's the guitar volume goes up to 10. Add an 11. So these groups could not be more anti-Israel if they tried, but so they need to add something at the end of the dial, and apartheid is that thing. And in the sense, the apartheid allegation is so easily refutable. It's so good. There's no separation in Israel of any population. Arabs have political rights. There's an Arab judge, a Muslim Arab, became the first Muslim judge on the Supreme Court. And every day Israelis, open up the news or go on Twitter to see, is the Muslim Brotherhood going to stay in the government or not stay in the government? Israel being the only country in the Middle East that has a Muslim Brotherhood party in the government rather than in the secret police cells, so jails. So why make an accusation so easy to refute? In a sense, it's a sign of desperation. On the other hand, it's also something about our media and cultural environment. Nobody's going to read long articles about this, but what matters now is just headlines, is just tweets. And in this, and we know we all live in an increasingly polarized political environment. And in that kind of environment, you need to make the most inflammatory accusations possible because people aren't going to really read it. They're not going to figure out. They're not going to listen to the explanations. So this is the idea that's very popular in media studies now of the Overton window. The Overton window is the parameters of acceptable argument. And by making a very extreme argument, they're in a sense shifting the parameters of what can be said. And most observers are going to think, that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So to get observers to adopt extreme views, you need to make the most extreme claims. We see this in our politics, and they're just mirroring it. I'll say one more final thing about why. Again, I'm not sitting there with Amnesty International at their meetings. But I think it's important, first of all, so I don't want to over-psychoanalyze them. So the best thing to do is to say what they said. So the American director of Amnesty International said, we don't believe, speaking to a sympathetic crowd after, said, we don't believe Israel should exist as a Jewish state. We're against the idea of a Jewish state. We're against the idea of a Jewish state. Guess what? That's Zionism is racism. So they are seeking to abolish Israel in the form that it was created in 1948, and they have made their agenda abundantly clear.
Yes, I'd like to ask a question to Payne. One of the most important points that you make in your essay titled The Terrorism of Untruths is that, and I'll quote you, the wars that Arab nations and Palestinian terrorists have been unable to win against Israel have opened up into a new theater, a war of defamatory words, anti-Semitic semantics, the semiotic of Palestinian suffering. Could you elaborate on this?
Well, it is obvious. Well, first of all, again, thanks for inviting Gene and myself. And I will not be able to beat Gene's Spinal Tap reference. That was classic, totally appropriate. And I didn't even know he was old enough to know that movie. 11. Yes, Adriana, it is obvious that Israel has won a number of wars, and its military capability has only enhanced to the point where Persian Gulf nations signed an Abraham Accords, in part because they know the regional superpower in the Middle East and North Africa and the Persian Gulf is Israel. So I think everyone, especially Palestinian sympathizers, are given up on the thought that this can be done by force. So what we saw initially in 1948, where encouraging Palestinians to flee their homes because we'll take care of the Israelis militarily, nobody believes that anymore. Nobody believes that Israel wouldn't be able to defeat Iran on its own. So they had to get to a different theater of war. And the one theater of war that I think has worked even before apartheid, and I am becoming increasingly more critical of this as I've gotten older, is the war on language. Some of it, I think, Israel is responsible for allowing it to go on as long as it did, and not creating the kind of Iron Dome defense that they have when it comes to errant rockets from Gaza, which is that, for instance, the denial of the right to exist. Right, this idea that this is being said, as Jean pointed out, since from the very beginning, when it's not being said about any other country, just one, right? So that it's this idea that, even the early peace proposal was, and you will finally agree that we have a right to exist. This is ridiculous, right? I don't even talk to people who don't believe I exist. I don't do anything with you. If that is a negotiating point, right? On the entire planet, you have one country that doesn't exist. Every other one exists but me, right? And so this idea that this was even a negotiating point instead of what it was a moral outrage from the very beginning. I have become increasingly, because I've just become I've just become disgusted with Palestinian intransigence, glorification of violence, their rejectionism. That I think that the capitulation on the word occupation, giant mistake, big step. I don't use it anymore. Unfortunately, there's too much early Thane Rosenbaum writing in which I use the word occupation. It's nonsense. It was never an occupation. Jean has written very eloquently about this, and in some ways influenced me, on the idea that, if anyone has the best legal title, everyone's got not tremendous legal title, but if there's any country that's got best legal title to the West Bank and Gaza, it's Israel. So the idea that this post-Oslo accommodation, where everyone, especially in Israel, and they still do refer to the word occupation. If you mess around with language, if words don't have common meaning, moral meaning, that are grounded in moral truths, historical and moral truths, then you get this next wave. You get something called apartheid, which is the absurdity of it. It doesn't belong in any conversation associated with Israel. Ethnic cleansing. I've been a human rights law professor for 30 years. I speak around the world. One of the things I always say is genocide is pretty clear. If you speak to the Congolese, the Rwandans, the Armenians, the Cambodians, and of course the Jews, at the end of a genocide, you have to have fewer people living than there were before. You have to have fewer people. 6 million has its own term of art for Jews. 800,000 has its own term of art for Rwandans, right? 1 million for Armenians, right? The Palestinian population has more than doubled since the, quote, occupation. Why are we using words like ethnic cleansing? People do not get to use the word genocide if there are more people alive today than when the genocide purportedly happened. And so again, unique to Israel alone, you see this sort of laziness when it comes to language. And it does seem that Israel's enemies have recognized that the war of words and the war of libels is something they can win. If it comes to fighting off the IDF, they can. But what I'm pointing out is that apartheid, it falls into a category of a number of other words that were always misapplied, that should never have been accepted. And Israel continues to have to fight these words. And apartheid is now, in particular, with these two new reports, the new word. Oh, and I would just lastly say, do not underestimate the George Floyd factor here in the United States. Black Lives Matter. It's true around the world. The word racism today, right? Associating yourself with racism, as you see in our political culture in the United States, everyone is called a racist. You could do anything and you're called a racist. So given the centrality of this word racism, you can see why Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have said, you know where we really got to go? We got to show racism because people are really stupid. They've been told we have a United States president who continues to say the word systemic racism. He doesn't know what it means. He really doesn't. And people use these words very casually. And I can say as a law professor, there is racism in the United States, but there's no systemic racism. But it doesn't matter. People will keep saying it. And I fear that you're seeing this with the apartheid report as well. It's cynical and deliberate. Use the word racism, associate it with Jews, and everyone will come along.
Well, Thane, let me pick up on words and definitions. Another important point that you make is that the reports from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch use the word apartheid even when the basic elements of the legal definition of apartheid are not met. Now, clearly, you're a professor of human rights law. Clearly, there are attorneys somewhere in those organizations. You would think who would vet the use of words, but yet this is what they're doing. So it's kind of like a casual throwing out. I think both of you have made that point. But the legal definition seems to have been lost somewhere in the background. The real legal definition.
Well, Dan, I don't know if I can answer this or you want Jean to answer, but I would simply say it's, again, not dissimilar to what we're seeing in the United States. I think that Amnesty International and Human Rights Commission have picked up, they're what's the word? Free riding. They're free riding on the focus on racism in the United States. So, for instance, they went to law school. They know that the Palestinians are not a race. They're a people. They're a nation. They're an ethnicity, but they're not a race. So to say the word racism applied to a people that are not a race, well, they go, well, maybe they're not a race, but we can use their ethnicity in the same category. Well, lawyers don't do that, right? That's not what they're supposed to do. You don't just fudge, well, you're not exactly a race. And similarly, they're saying, well, Jean makes this point repeatedly too. Well, there's no actual separation. Yeah, that's right. There's not. In Israel, Arabs and Jews ride public accommodations, public transportation, sit in the same restaurants, sit together in rock concerts. There's no actual separation or systematic oppression and separation that is required for the definition of apartheid. It doesn't exist. So they've come up with something that I think is very similar to what you see in the United States, which means inequality. If you see inequality, then you can just add everything to it. And so that's what they're also saying. Talk about bastardizing the word. And they're saying, well, you may be right. There's no separation and they're not really a race. But if there's inequity between Jews and Arabs, it can only mean one thing. Jews are racists. It can't be anything else. And it's, by the way, notice it is exactly the argument that's being used in the United States. If there is any inequality or any disparity between the races, it can't have anything to do with anything else. It's not about hard work. It's not about effort. It's not about intact families. It's not about anything but race. It's the only reason for inequality. And that's exactly what's going on in this report. They're completely ignoring the legal definition. And they're saying, well, as long as there's inequality between the Jews and Arabs, Israel must be racist. And therefore, it's an apartheid state.
Let me just add something to
Sure.
I want to just point out why it's important to talk about the legal definition. The legal definition is important to point out, and I want to also offer a thought about do they have lawyers in these organizations. I want to make it, Thane isn't suggesting that like Israel's doing something like apartheid, but they get off on a technicality. Now, apartheid has a very long definition of which none of the aspects match up, not a single one. But the definition is long and complicated to show how extraordinary a crime apartheid is. And how extraordinary is it? So far, the international community and these organizations have only deemed one country in the whole history of human badness to be an apartheid country, namely South Africa. Not China with the sterilization of the Uyghurs, not to mention Tibet, and there's so many things. Not Iran with the elimination of the Baha'i, essentially. None of that. So it's a high standard, and it's supposed to be an awesome term, like the worst accusation. But you need lawyers to make rules, because rules are designed to apply to other cases, right? You need a definition, and you need to really think about what definition you're using if you're going to think, oh, well, how's the next case going to? Do we really want to call country X, call it Iran, which is only half Persian and half many other ethnic groups? Do you want to call that an apartheid state? They don't need lawyers, because they don't need to ask that question, because it's clear in everyone's mind from the beginning that this is what Justice Scalia used to call a one-ride ticket, right? Like a one-way, good for this ride only. You tear it up afterwards, and there were Amnesty International, I think, to show this. They're not just engaged in sort of writing reports; they're engaged in propaganda and advocacy. They took out ads in the UK at bus stops and tube stations, and they said like apartheid countries in the history of the world. South Africa, 1. 2, Israel. So it's clear they're done. They're not interested in China. They're not interested in anything really. And so they don't really need to be careful with the definition, because they're very conscious of the enterprise that they're engaged in. So I just want to point out, I think Thane did them too much justice to suggest that they're conflating racism or racial inequality with apartheid, because there's more racial inequality in much of the world, including probably the United States, than in Israel, but they're not sticking the apartheid sticker on those. So it's racial inequality of result if you're Israel. So really it's just, and if you're Israel does all the work there.
Well, Jean, you actually answered part of my question, because it was, I wanted to ask you about the methodology used by these reports to conclude that Israel is an apartheid state.
Yes. So the methodology is very simple, so there's a definition. You need various kinds of acts of murder, enslavement, oppression, etc. So they really skip that, and what they do, it's what I call throwing the dart and drawing a target around it. They basically have a list of Israeli policies that they don't like since 1948. Many of these policies are debatable as a policy matter. For example, the nation-state law was a big debate in the Israeli Knesset, whether to have Hebrew as the sole official language. Almost every country in the world has only one sole official language, regardless of how many minorities it has. But okay, it's a debatable. It's a debatable thing. So they take everything Israel does that they don't like. Much of these being policies that were only adopted in response to waves of terror, and not for clearly any kind of purpose of domination. And then they say, so it all adds up to apartheid. But you can tell there's no methodology, because the first practices they cite is 1948, the establishment of a Jewish state. So they see it as apartheid from birth, and thus a result, anything Israel obviously does as a Jewish state, or to secure itself, will be apartheid. And most notably in their methodology, they discuss the whole history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without mentioning Oslo, without mentioning that Israel allowed the creation of a Palestinian government, which governs the lives of 90% of Palestinians. Now, they might say, oh, those are Bantu, like South African Bantustan. South Africa purported to create autonomous black homelands. But the difference is the international community didn't recognize those autonomous black homelands and said they're Bantustans because they were clearly puppets. Nobody thinks Mahmoud Abbas is an Israeli puppet. He's not like reading instructions from Israel when he passes the pay for slave legislation, allocating 7% of the Palestinian Authority budget for the murder of Israelis, when he flies around launching international prosecutions against Israel. He's clearly not a puppet. Whatever you think of it. And it's clearly not a puppet state, which is why it's actually recognized by about as many countries as recognized Israel. The existence of the Palestinian Authority, which governs the daily lives of 90% of Palestinians, and is the government with which they interact, governs their taxes, their education, their welfare, their pensions, everything. Is not mentioned in the report. It's as if it never happened. The Intifadas, as if they never happened, and Israel's offer on at least 4 separate occasions of the creation of a state. Right? Imagine if the South Africans said to Nelson Mandela, "Hey, you wanna have a country? But some other time, I want more territory for him." Right? He wouldn't be Nelson Mandela. So they just miss that. So and then anything that Israel does, they say, oh, that's proof. And I have to say, and the list is too long, but they both distort facts and they also invent a fair number. I think that's a short description of the methodology.
Can I just add something to
comment? Go ahead. Sure.
I just want to add something quickly to the Abbas anecdote that Gene just discussed, which is that there may have even been a more cynical reason not to talk about the Palestinian Authority. Because if you talk about the Palestinian Authority, you realize that Abbas is now, in the 14th year of a 4-year term, right? So if you focus on the Palestinian Authority, it's not just that the international community recognized the creation of a governmental unit that would supervise and play the role of a government for the West Bank Palestinians. But then you have to get around, oh my God, they're not a democracy. They don't recognize the rule of law. They don't have democratic institutions. They don't accept liberal values. And they hate that Israel can point to that. They hate that guys like Gene and Thane Rosenbaum can point to that. And so here they are, Amnesty International. They're reluctant. Yes, the paper, their report is filled with utter, lies and bad faith. Yes, but there's even more strategic reasons to leave some information out, because the good news is ultimately bad news, because it demonstrates, again, why don't we talk about the 5 rejected offers for statehood? Well, because then it makes you realize that statehood isn't what they're interested in. What they're interested in is dead Jews. When they can't acknowledge that, why would Amnesty International say, yes, this is about, let's kill some more Jews? So the idea is if they credit the peace offers, then they have a problem to have to try to explain that, how are Jews racist? How are Jews interested in a separation if they've made peace proposals? And yes, how laughable that would be if you said to a Black Afrikaner, how many times did the white population offer you a country? I mean, they would look at you. Again, all of these things are an insult to the nations that ultimately experience these abuses and oppressions. The ethnic cleansing charge, and of course, the apartheid as well.
Then just to go back, I think it was Gene who referenced Paul O'Brien, the Amnesty International USA director, saying in March that he's opposed to the idea that Israel should be preserved as a state for the Jewish people. No, I think it was Natan Sharansky years ago already who said, people are beginning to say, academics, NGOs, in the human rights field, were beginning to say, well, maybe the creation of Israel was a big mistake. This story, the Paul O'Brien story, was a 2-day story, and people kind of dismissed it. Is this the direction we're going in? So we've gone from, as you've said, we've gone from human rights abuses to the word occupation. Now we're at apartheid. Now we've got Paul O'Brien saying, well, this whole thing is just a mistake. I'm against it. Where is that? Where does that lead?
Well, you're right, Dan. What you're seeing now, I think, is more honesty, about what their intentions are. The intentions is to say, remember, most of the states in the United Nations emerged after World War II as part of the decolonization of the world. I think 2/3 of the countries in the United Nations were created just the way Israel was, that a major Western power used to be here, and then there were partitions and we carved things up, right? So when we talk about Israel, it's, again, using the language, settler colonial enterprise, right? There's a fancy term of art to say what? Well, what does that say? Jews from Los Angeles and London and Brooklyn went down to a country that they have no connection to, called Israel, and they stole Arab land. That's the story, right? Jews that's why UNESCO spent so much time denying the biblical connection, the historic connection, Jews to this ancestral homeland. The story that they like to tell in order to say that this is a colonial enterprise is to say white people stole land from people of color, right? White people that have no business being there, right? The fact that most Israelis are actually people of color, very inconvenient truth. It just so happens Mizrahi Sephardic Jews are people of color. It doesn't fit the story of Brooklyn invaders, Los Angeles invaders, Amsterdam invaders, white, very, 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 very white people stole land from dark, dark, dark people. And again, it fits into this broader issue of racism and colonialism. So one idea is to think about, well, there's another word that gets used, settler colonialism, when in fact, if you really don't like Israel as a colonial enterprise, then you really need to give the country back to the British. You don't give it back to the Palestinians because there never was a Palestinian nation run by Arabs. There was a Palestinian nation run by Jews. It was called Judea, and they had a King David and a King Solomon, right? But Arabs have never had control in any nationalistic way, governmental way of that region. So to decolonize means, oh, you mean you want to bring it back but that's not how people understand it. They understand it as Israel stole a country from an Arab country, but there was never an Arab country in Palestine or in Gaza, not since the Philistines, at least in Gaza. So this argument of legitimacy is this new wave that's becoming accepted, where you're really saying it's a colonial enterprise, so therefore it's racist, and it was illegitimate from its beginnings, because it required the stealing of land that belonged to others. But as I said before, if you're making that argument about Israel, you have to knock out 2/3 of the UN. You have to basically say to all the countries, all of your countries are really on probation. It's provisional. We really got to take another look at that. Because remember, Israel was voted upon in the United Nations, right? It was created, the concept of a partition for Israel was created during the League of Nations with the codification of the San Remo Conference and the Treaty of Sèvres. This is stuff that Gene knows way better than anyone on the planet, and he can explain this better. But, you can make this legal argument, very strong scholarly argument, that, Israel has been accepted under international law. This didn't just start with Amnesty International yesterday. This has been going on from the end of World War I, that you started to see the legal architecture for the creation of a Jewish state. So for now, they have to see these anti-Semitic enterprises, Amnesty International, Human Rights Commission, counsel saying, this was never legitimate. You have, in order to make that claim, you have to ask. They have to make the case. Well, you mean nothing was legitimate? The League of Nations, that enterprise, the San Remo resolution was not. The United Nations voting on Israel, I think that was Resolution 181. None of that applies. It applies to all the other countries that were created after World War II when we decolonized so much of that part of the world. But one country is illegitimate and all the others are legitimate?
Adriana.
Yes. Then I'd like to ask Eugene. He mentioned something about that, but he makes the critically important point in his essay about that the reports ignore the Oslo Accords, and most importantly, that they ignore the apartheid-like policies of the Palestinian Authority and the rulers of Gaza. Maybe he can tell us more about that.
I think Palestinian apartheid is an important thing to speak about, because if you need further proof of the agenda-driven nature of these reports, they're looking at the area between the river and the sea, the area which is together controlled by Israel and the Palestinian Authority, and they're looking for apartheid. And so if you look at any area under Israeli control, Israel area C of the West Bank, you'll see both Arabs and Jews live there. Both Arabs and Jews can go to the same shopping centers, sit at the same cafe. Then go 100 meters over to the areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority, areas A and B of the West Bank, almost 90% of the city of Hebron, and the Gaza Strip. And where are the Jews then? Where are the Jews? There are no Jews. Now, given that an apartment in Jerusalem costs millions of shekels, the fact that you don't have a single Jew buying an apartment in Ramallah, which is 10 minutes away, it requires explanation. It's not just because. And we know it's not, people say, oh, well, Jews wouldn't want to live in an Arab-controlled place. That is absolutely not true. In the United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain, even in Saudi Arabia, there's Jews where their security can be guaranteed. But the Palestinian Authority has policies of what's apartheid mean? Actually creating apartness, to have peoples, races separated. And the Palestinian Authority actually has rules exactly like that. Jews can't buy land. Palestinians have the death penalty for selling land to Jews. Jews don't have real estate rights. Jews can't worship. There's a list of a dozen Jewish holy sites under exclusive Palestinian control, which under the Oslo Accords, Jews are guaranteed, and under basic international human rights law, guaranteed free access and free worship. Jews don't pray at any of those sites, except occasionally they sneak in the middle of the night under armed guard. Jews don't have freedom of religion, right? So, and of course, Jews are erased, both physical erasure through the Pay for Slay program, where funds the extrajudicial execution of Jews, and of course, historically and culturally erased. They're creating a complete Jew-free zone, where Jews don't exist in the present and they don't exist in history. It's pure. The South Africans, by the South African regime did not go that far, right, of erasing blacks from African history. They're just stuck with the present. So they're erasing from the present and from the past. There's no Jews. And Mahmoud Abbas has said he will not accept a Palestinian state with a single Jew living there. Not a single Jew. Palestinian president has described the ban on selling land to Jews as being like the holy of holies of their legislation. It's not just a real estate rule; it's a fundamental national principle. Okay, now do those policies amount to apartheid? Maybe, maybe not. But there is a legal definition, and that definition is very demanding, right? But it's a lot closer. It begs analysis. Not a single one of those things is mentioned in this report. So this is like the drunken man looking for his keys under the lamppost, because that's where the light is. They know where they want to look, and even if it's not where they're going to find. And there's no excuse for this, except obviously this is an operation to frame Israel. And the proof is that they don't mention any of this. So maybe there is what to talk about on the apartheid front. And I think the apartheid-like nature of these Palestinian policies are not talked about sufficiently. In the sense, too many, because, and part of it is because I think people who are not afraid to speak out in defense of Israel, they're always on the defensive. They're just trying to show that Israel's not a horrible, monstrous country, so they don't really have the bandwidth to talk about, the fact that a Jew would get killed for buying a house, Arab would get killed for selling a house in Jerusalem to a Jew. But I think we need to pay much more attention to that, in part because, of course, Arabs are the victims also of these policies. Palestinians are the victims.
And it's not just that the report doesn't acknowledge what Gene said, which is, there is no contemplation in any framework for an Palestinian country in the Middle East where Jews would be allowed to live. It's not just that. It's that the report also doesn't say, oh, by the way, 20% of Israel is made up of Arab Palestinians, just to show you the contrast. It's not just that one country would make it Jew-free. Right? You could not be a Jew and live in any country called Palestine. So if you're going to give the Palestinians country, you have to recognize that it's not going to be a place that Jews can live, and it's going to be a place where homosexuals will be torched and thrown off buildings. Where's the progressive outrage about that? And where are the feminists, where women could very easily be stoned, beheaded, will be held to be illiterate, they won't be able to learn to read. Any number of things that you would see under certainly strict Muslim Brotherhood Sharia law adherence. But it's this other thing that is just so intellectually gross to say, oh, and by the way, if you go into Israel, you'll notice that there are Palestinian Arabs who are on the Supreme Court and who are, sitting on the same bus with Jews and in restaurants. And serving in the government, not just in the government in the Knesset, but in the coalition itself. This time, you have Arab countries. This is like the most inconvenient truth that does not appear in the report. And if you want to talk about intellectual dishonesty, you add what Gene just said, which is you're talking about this is beyond apartheid. Jews wouldn't be allowed to live in any Arab country called Palestine, but Arabs can, yes, is there racism against Arabs in Israel? Yes, just like there's racism here in the United States against African Americans. But there are civil liberties and there are equal rights and there's the opportunity. I mean, look, one of the things about apartheid that is most outrageous is that it wasn't more than a few years ago that Israel crowned a Miss Israel who was Ethiopian. This looks to you like apartheid? A woman of dark skin, not as Mizrahi skin, Ethiopian skin, is Miss Israel with pride. That's Miss Israel, and you have the audacity to use the words apartheid. If I were a South African Black person, I would be outraged. I can't even imagine this idea that we could have had a Miss South Africa who was Black at some point competing in an international competition. So it's much worse that they don't explain what would happen in a Palestine. They just leave out the most crucial elements of pluralism and Israel's democratic institutions that completely undercut all of these arguments about evil Israel.
Gene, this is what we're really talking about here. Really is anti-Zionism. If we roll all of this up, all that we discussed here on this program today, this can be all put together under the rubric of anti-Zionism. How do we begin to push back? Because the sense here, this is a perfect storm, and I'd like both of you to respond to this. I mean, you've got Michael Link, the outgoing UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories, issued a report to the UN Human Rights Council accusing Israel of the crime of apartheid in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, Link of course, has a long history of anti-Israel activity. It's most likely he got the position for this. You have to have qualifications in order to be in this kind of hostile position against Israel. So we have the report by link. We have the upcoming report of the Commission of Inquiry, and I know that Adriana would like to talk about that in a moment. And these incendiary reports from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty. So we have a perfect storm being formed here against Israel. What are the suggestions here to push back? Because it's coming from every place we look. We've got it on campus. We've got it in the United Nations. We've got it from various governments. Everywhere we look. So what are the answers to not only rebutting but turning this tide back? So, Gene, let's start with you and then Thane.
I think there's different answers in different fora. So, for example, the United Nations, nothing actually happens there. And I think, in a sense, these reports are a bit like voodoo. The more you believe in it, the more it works. So I think Israel needs to just keep its cool, keep on going. And, in 1975, when they first made the apartheid accusation, Israel's position was so much more precarious. It was 1975. America had just lost Vietnam. Soviet Union was taking over everywhere, and this was a Soviet resolution, and things looked very bad. We survived that. Survived some more UN resolutions. We just need to keep cool. Campus is a bit of a different challenge because I think the apartheid allegation is used to intimidate Jewish students, to discredit pro-Israel causes, and to sort of impact the educational formative experiences of many young Americans. The problem is, and Thane alluded to this earlier, Israel's sort of response of Israel's, those who want to tell the truth about Israel, is often is not going to be, I think, the solution, because they say Israel's an apartheid state. Israel's defenders will say, no, it's not an apartheid state. Yes, there's racism, there's other problems, it's not a perfect country. What do people hear? Israel's between imperfect and apartheid, so let's call it like quasi-apartheid, very bad. But whatever you're talking about why Israel is or is not an apartheid state. So the people it creates a mental association. I believe that's one of the tactical goals of this movement on campus. They're not going to convince everyone who think about it, that Israel is an actual apartheid state. But you walk by and you just see on the quads how many people actually stop and look at the literature that they're giving out. Israel apartheid, it creates some kind of negative association. And simply rebutting it is necessary. I think it's necessary to rebut that, but it is not adequate. And I think it's important to shift the discussion to real human rights abuses, because in a sense you're wasting your breath talking about why. Let me put it this way: I liken the apartheid accusation to a blood libel in many ways. I have a lecture I give about it, modern blood libels. It's wild, it's crazy. Blood libel, the claim of the use of Christian babies' blood in matzah, it's wild in many ways. But if someone says, "Hey, Jews, you're using Christian babies' blood to make matzah," you don't say, "No, it has an OU certificate, non-gebracht. We can guarantee you kosher to the highest standard. The Hasidim will eat it." No. That's not a response, right? That you don't argue the facts with a blood libel. You don't say, "Look, really, like in halacha, blood is very unkosher." That's the wrong response. But that's often what our response about I've done this myself. I'm not blaming anyone. When say apartheid, we have a Supreme Court justice, and we have the acting president of Israel, and the army officers and the generals. It's a little bit like pointing to the heksha when the kosher certification in response to a blood libel. We need to be talking about Palestinian apartheid. And on campus, I was happy to have been a bit involved in this. For the first time this year, a campus group, students supporting Israel, had Palestinian apartheid week events on several campuses. And I think that's crucial to beginning to establish the truth.
Thane, would you like to comment on that? And then we'll go to Adriana.
I would say, just briefly, two things. One is, and this is something that, is a B'nai B'rith moral imperative in my view, which is a radicalized, very, very aggressive public education campaign for Jews. What Gene and I are talking about is just, it's as if we're talking Talmud for most Jews on the planet. They don't know anything. They know how to renovate a kitchen. They know how to get their kids into dental school. They know certain things. But virtually nothing that Gene and I said tonight is widely known by anybody, even people who purport to know stuff and read, but they don't know. I mean, they would be shocked. I hope if they're watching, they're taking notes. So because that's not to mean that I think that rebutting the charge is going to make a difference. That was the point Gene's making. And I agree. Saying, if someone wants to call you, if you're a dirty Jew, you're a dirty Jew. And they don't use that word anymore. They use apartheid. They say ethnic cleansers. They don't use the word dirty Jew. This is anti-Semitism, right? And so that's what this is really about. It is a way, the Palestinians conveniently created a wonderful opportunity to legitimize anti-Semitism by dressing it up in a human rights issue. Now we get to say dirty Jew, but we can do it without using the word dirty Jew because we're much more sophisticated people now. We're not some peasants from Ukraine and Poland. We have to come up with a better way to hate Jews. So let's do it this way. Let's undermine their state. Let's call them land grabbers. They steal land, and they're murderers. Blood libel. Another one. They're murderers of Palestinian people with ethnic cleansing. Again, a population that has doubled somehow is an object of genocide, and they're an apartheid state. But at least, even if it doesn't work, Jews should be at the ready to rebut. Whether it works or not, I don't know. If you're talking to someone who hates you, they hate you. You're not going to out-talk them of it or convince them of it. The second thing, and I just briefly, this is very important, and Gene knows this from university life with Title VI, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which 28 states have approved, including the United States State Department, which is now you're starting to see some pushback. You're going to see this at Harvard. You're seeing this at Duke, at University of North Carolina, at Princeton, where when they stumble into this, Jews don't have a right to exist as a self-determined nation. Jews are held to a higher standard, as Gene said. All the other human rights abusers around the world, we have no tables with literature about them. None. We're not interested in all of those real human rights. We're only interested in one state. And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance makes several points about what is anti-Semitism. And Israel and American Jews should be insisting that that definition be applied. And if you're receiving government funds, we are stripping you of government funds because you are an anti-Semite, and the government doesn't give money to anti-Semites. And what the two key points are denying the self-determination of the Jewish people to their own homeland is anti-Semitism. Well, Gene already quoted the executive director of Amnesty International, who said, I don't believe that there should be a Jewish homeland. Well, according to the definition that 28 states have adopted, that guy, O'Brien, is a Jew-hating anti-Semite. And everywhere he walks, someone should say, there goes a Jew-hating anti-Semite, according to the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the other part, that's another category in the definition, is holding Israel to a standard that is not being applied to any other nation. That's the point that Gene has made repeatedly. And so the fact is that if you don't have any other tables on campus about apartheid regimes and ethnic cleansing, and you only have one table, and it happens to be about Jews and there's the self-determination and their ancestral homeland in the one liberal democracy in the Middle East, then clearly you're violating that definition of anti-Semitism. You are engaged in anti-Semitism, and you should be stripped of federal funding. Those two things, making people more aware of how to reply and more strictly and aggressively using the new definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
We got time for just one more question. Adriana.
Yes, before I ask the next question to Eugene, I'd like to make a comment. I'm so glad that they mentioned anti-Semitism, because this war of words, this demonization of Israel, you say in your essay that it's fed by the general public's ignorance of geography and history, but also by anti-Semitism. And I think this is very important for us to highlight. I'd like to ask Eugene, several governments have rejected the characterization of Israel as an apartheid state and have strongly condemned these reports. Most recently, the government of the Netherlands did so. Do you think that this will ultimately affect the credibility of these organizations?
The credibility of these organizations is kind of locked in by virtue of their size and self-congratulatory nature, and the incestuous relationship they have with UN organizations, which rely on them for information. And I think they're too big to fail. That's maybe one of the things they calculated. I don't think anyone's going to go out of business for being too hard on the Jews. I do think it's important that we do point out that we need to. The point of this allegation is to fundamentally discredit, to delegitimize Israel. And as Thane suggested, the people who make this allegation need to be delegitimized. So when you come with such an accusation, you better be right. So then when very liberal countries like Holland, when some of the most progressive politicians in America, many Democratic congressmen and senators have rejected this, right? That should call Amnesty's credibility into account. And we need to emphasize how, especially in America, how many Democratic and progressive members of progressive politicians have said that this is just simply not true. I mean, we could also add that Mahmoud Abbas has also said that Israel is not a Palestinian state. I'd rather not rely not an apartheid state. I'd rather not rely on him, but he has said it too. And I think that needs to be pointed out over and over again, because otherwise you just have the authority, the sort of unbiased authority of Amnesty. And Netherlands is a country that cares vastly about human rights, and it's very unusual for them to publicly criticize an Amnesty report. The UK, many countries have rejected it. I don't know a single country that's actually said, yes, like this is the case. So that is important to point out.
Well, I want to thank both of you. Next up, actually, the next time we meet, perhaps, is a discussion about the Commission of Inquiry, which was established by the UN Human Rights Council. It has no shelf life. It's open-ended. Its purpose is simply to exist, to engage in this kind of rhetoric using apartheid, hostility toward Israel. It has a staff of some 18 people. It is headed. The three commissioners are known for their hostility toward Israel. And this yet opens up another avenue of this kind of defamation of Israel and the Jewish state. So we should be on the lookout for that. Their first report is scheduled to be given in June of this year. But again, with no shelf life, the activity of this particular committee connected to the Human Rights Council, again, is something that we need to be watching very, very closely. So our thanks again to Eugene Kantorovich and Thane Rosenbaum for joining us and sharing their analysis. And thank you for tuning in to this special conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed the interview, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guests, Eugene and Thane and Adriana, thank you to my colleague. And for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.